It was just another ceremony on base. One of those formal mornings when the brass polished their medals and cadets stood straighter than ever. The sun was just beginning to heat the concrete, and the flags barely moved in the soft wind. Rows of uniforms lined the chairs, stiff-backed and proud. Families sat in the rear, murmuring gently, waiting for the general to arrive. It was a day to honor service, but no one expected it to become something they'd never forget. She wasn't supposed to stand out. She never did. She walked quietly with a slow, steady step, her hands tucked into the pockets of a faded olive-green jacket. It was old, almost too old. Stitching along the collar had started to fray, and the sleeves didn't quite reach her wrists anymore. The boots she wore were scuffed, laces faded to gray. Everything about her looked worn, not dirty, just aged, like something that had lived through too much but still chose to keep walking. Some of the younger cadets noticed her first. They were clustered off to the side, half watching, half whispering, as she took a seat near the middle of the gathering. One elbowed the other and chuckled quietly. "Look at that jacket," he whispered, straight out of Nam. "Maybe she got lost," the other said, smirking. "He probably thinks it's a VA clinic." They weren't trying to be cruel, but they were young, yet too young to understand what history sometimes looks like. They saw a woman in her late 60s, maybe older, thin hair pinned back neatly. No name badge, no ribbons, just that tired old jacket with a strange patch over the heart. The patch was barely visible from where they stood, faded into the fabric, the edges soft from years of wear. They didn't recognize it, but someone did. A few minutes later, the general arrived. Not just any general, Marcus Ellington. Known for his silence, his precision, his refusal to entertain politics or flattery, he didn't smile often, and when he did, it meant something. As he stepped up to the podium, he gave the usual scan of the crowd, measuring, observing. His eyes passed over dozens of uniforms. Then they stopped. They stopped on her. There was a flicker in his expression, barely a second of pause. He stepped down from the podium, walked slowly across the aisle, right past his aides. Everyone turned to watch. Conversations hushed. No one spoke. The general approached the woman in the old jacket. She stood slowly, unsure of what to do. He looked at her chest, at the faded patch, half covered by the fabric's fold. His posture shifted. He took off his cap. He didn't salute. He didn't speak. Simply removed his cap and lowered his head. The air changed. No one understood what was happening. The cadets from earlier stared, mouths slightly open, hands suddenly unsure of where to rest. Even the colonels watched silently, confused. But the woman, her eyes didn't widen. She didn't react with pride. She simply looked back at the general and gave a tiny nod. That was all. A moment between two people who knew what that patch meant. After a few seconds, the general stepped back. He turned toward the crowd and said only one sentence. "She wore that patch when no one else would." Then he put his cap back on, returned to the podium, and began the ceremony like nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Word spread fast after the event. Someone had snapped a picture of the moment. It made its way onto a military forum. A few older vets began posting stories. Stories about a medic unit that operated deep behind enemy lines during a conflict that never made headlines. A unit made up of volunteers, mostly women who were trained to handle battlefield wounds without support. They operated alone, carried no weapons. And this woman, in that faded jacket, was one of the only surviving members. The patch she wore? It was the insignia of Shadow Company Medevac 9, a name that wasn't in textbooks. You had to serve too. Know it. You had to bleed to respect it. Turns out she had pulled injured soldiers out of wrecked helicopters with bullets flying over her head, carried wounded men through mud while explosions shook the ground. She never got medals. She never asked. She just came home and faded back into the crowd. She never updated the jacket. Had stains that couldn't come out. Threads that told. Stories without words. That patch wasn't a display, was a scar made of fabric. A few days after the event, the cadets who had laughed found her name. They requested to meet her. She agreed. They apologized. She didn't scold them. Instead, she smiled gently and said, "You weren't wrong. It's an old jacket. But I wore it when I needed it most." One of them asked what the patch meant. She looked at him for a long time, then said, "It means I stayed when others ran. It means I held a man's hand while he died, so he wouldn't feel alone." They didn't know what to say. Before they left, one cadet asked her why she never replaced it. She looked down at the jacket, rubbed her thumb along the edge of the patch, said, "Because this jacket remembers, even when the world forgets." Word of the general's gesture spread across bases. Quietly, respectfully, there were no news stories, no press coverage, just whispers, nods. A new kind of reverence for someone who wore her service on her sleeves, not her chest. And at the next ceremony, she was invited again. This time no one laughed. In fact, when she arrived, the cadets stood. Every one of them, not because of her rank, not because of a speech, but because they had finally learned what real honor looked like. The base never officially recorded what unit she came from. There were no files anyone could access, no medals listed under her name, no mission logs detailing what she'd done. But legends don't need paperwork. They need witnesses. Now, this entire base had become one. The whispered stories spread far beyond the walls, shared over coffee mugs, late-night guard posts, and whispered phone calls to other soldiers in other places. "Have you heard about the woman with the black viper tattoo?" they'd say. No one could explain how she ended up with a mop in her hand that day, but everyone knew it wasn't by accident. It was a test, a lesson. And every soldier who saw it carried that lesson into every decision they made after. Young recruits started to change. Not overnight, but noticeably. The lazy postures straightened, the arrogance faded. When they passed her in the hallway, they didn't stare, they saluted. Even though she wore no visible rank, they felt it in her stride. In training rooms, instructors would glance at her silently sitting in the corner and adjust their tone. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. They knew she'd seen war in ways no textbook could teach. That mop she once held became a symbol on its own, an inside joke turned quiet monument. Someone even painted one on a wall mural with the words, "Respect walks quietly." Then one day, she was gone. No announcement, no farewell, just an empty bunk and a folded note left on her cot. It read, "Mission complete. Thanks for keeping it clean." No name. Just a symbol, a small, inked black viper under the signature line. The entire base fell into a stunned silence. They searched for her, filed inquiries, called up contacts, but no one could track her. Some believed she was reassigned on another quiet mission. Others said she was never truly part of the base's roster at all, that she had come back only to check if today's military still remembered humility, if they still knew what quiet power looked like. And once she saw it return, she vanished again into the fog of her own legend. Years later, her story still lived on. New soldiers arriving at the base were told about her within their first week. Not in lectures, but in quiet stories around the mess hall. There was even a ceremony every year, unsanctioned, and never publicized. A small group would gather by the mural with the mop. No speeches, just silence. 1 minute of stillness. 1 minute of remembering that strength has many forms. Some march in front of battalions, others mop floors without complaint, and some carry tattoos that mean more than entire pages in history books. And though many would forget her name more, perhaps never learned, and no one forgot what she represented. She was the reminder that real heroes don't need recognition, that some of the greatest warriors don't lead from a podium, but from the background. They step forward only when absolutely necessary. When they leave, they do it the same way they arrived, quietly, humbly, without asking for thanks, because their power isn't in the noise they make, it's in the silence they earn.